So I can't decide if this is actually Heisenberg's uncertainty principle or simply not having a control group for my scientific experiment. But I'm going to poison the well all the same, and wow, I just mixed up all kinds of things, and never mind. Regardless, from what I have been told, it is fairly reasonable to conclude that 90% of the people who will stop watching this video have stopped by the 30-second mark. And I realize, looking back at all my videos, that I always start the videos with one of technically many, but only really two patterns of Sacred Cow Shipyards video intros. And maybe I'm losing some people on the long one especially. Maybe I'm not. I don't know. Either way, we are clearly trying something different today. Since we're obviously listening to not an intro right now, right? Right? Who is in charge of editing this video again? Oh, right. Me. Darn. So without further ado, welcome to Sacred Cow Shipyards, where no ship is safe from being slaughtered like a cow. And frankly, let's be honest here, that intro that preceded the intro probably lost me 90% of the people who were going to leave this video already, so I'm not sure that poisoning the well was such a good idea, but you would think from the phrase that I would have known that. And here we are. Regardless, this week we are going to talk about an obvious topic of conversation. Because, well, what else am I doing here except conversating with you? Because this weekend, the next installation of the Alien franchise just dropped. And that is to say, Alien Romulus. Now, I have a lot of complaints about the name Alien Romulus. But I'm not going to get into those today. Maybe that'll be a short in the future or something. I mean, my complaints are fairly concise and fairly correct, in my opinion. So they might fit under the minute limit that YouTube's inflicts on shorts. So maybe we'll get there eventually. Instead, we're going to talk about, something fundamental in the Alien franchise. And despite all the requests I have received, and they have been many, I will grant you that, we are not actually talking about the Sulaco. Sorry. We'll get there, I promise, eventually. Always leave them wanting more, right? Instead, we are in fact, going to talk about, the very fundamental, ship of Alien franchise universe monstrosity that has become. That is to say, the Nostromo. After all, this absolute tub is literally where the alien multiverse universe, I don't even know how to describe this thing, because now we have aliens and then we have predators and they all somehow mesh together in some weird way, and we've got offshoots and this, that, and the fornicatingly other. Regardless, the alien concept started more or less on the Nostromo. Technically, it started on the engineer's ship, but there's not a lot of information about those, so I prefer not to talk about those. They don't make a lot of sense. So, instead, we're going to talk about the Nostromo. So where do we start? I guess we can technically start with what she isn't. What the Nostromo is not is that entire fornicating edifice, actually 4 separate edifices, that you see in front of you. In fact, the Nostromo is this little tiny thing attached to the front of that monstrosity. Because in the end, in her current incarnation, at least in terms of the movie, the Nostromo was a tug. Now, I guess I should back up a little and explain what that absolute monstrous monstrosity is. It's a kind of like, it's an in-flight refinery, if you can believe that phrase. I mean, as I say that phrase, it sounds stupid, but no, that's basically what it is. In fact, the Nostromo actually left Earth in 2120 and then spent 1 month in Neptune hooking up with the cargo hauler, which is basically what you see in the movie. And then it did some, quasi-FTL interstellar journey to Thetis, which is approximately 59 light years trailward from Earth. And by trailward, they mean how your galaxy spins. It's down the arm as opposed to up the arm. I'm not sure I agree with that terminology, but still, fine. They went to Thetis. Fine. Once at Thetis, the actual refinery spent 8 weeks in orbit, along with the Nostromo, I guess, because she was attached to the refinery. And they were just loading her up with raw materials for processing on the way back to Earth. Because again, we are a long way from Terra, right? I just said 59 light years, right? There's a lot of processing that can happen in 59 light years of transit. So why not do it in transit? Well, they do. Because honestly, why waste the time? And if you believe the book Alien the Blueprints, and I tend to, each of those spires on the refinery had a different job. For example, the front right processing tower had communication and automated ore sorting, also sizing. The rear right tower was responsible for separation and concentration. The rear left tower was responsible for storage and minerals refinement. And finally, the front left tower was where they basically stored everything that they produced. But along the way, they had to separate all the materials from water for some reason, which is why the refinery assembly thing that the Nostromo was towing had all these blisters on the bottom of it. That's where they separated the water from the useful things, and the water mostly ended up in the blisters and was stored, and I'm sure they'll do something with it at some point in the future, because actually the water is actually reaction mass for the Nostromo, but we'll get there. Slow your boat, yo. Now what's funny is that actually the refinery never really comes up in the original Alien movie. And thereby it never comes up at all, because at the end of the original Alien movie, it gets vaporized when the Nostromo goes pop. But the funny thing is that it does have its own story. For example, it's a Cygnus Tesotech 2100 TAC B commercial mineral and ore refinery / transportation rig. And they are meant to be towed behind, well, tugs. But the Nostromo was not built as a tug. But before we get to the Nostromo herself, let's talk about the refinery for just a second. I mean, the refinery doesn't actually matter in terms of the movie. No one ever goes into the refinery. The alien, the xenomorph, never goes into the refinery. It's simply just an artifact that bolted onto the back of the Nostromo. It's not technically relevant, I guess, perhaps. Aside from Ridley Scott being, well, Ridley Scott. He has, in fact, this massive hang-up about religious iconography to the point where the original stacks on the refinery, the towers, were supposed to be nearly twice as tall on the models that were made. And then at some point, for some reason that no one has actually ever been able to pin down, Ridley Scott decided those towers were too tall and took a hammer and chisel to them and knocked them down to the scale and size that they now occupy in the Alien universe. I'm kind of curious how tall they were to begin with. I mean, frankly, they seem disproportionately large in the original Alien movie. So how much more ridiculous could they have been? I mean, I say that and then I think about that and then I realize how badly they could have been huge. I get that. But still, it's funny because those towers are actually the processing plants for a lot of metals. According again to Alien the Blueprints, this refinery was meant to produce things like bauxite and chromite and butyrite. I don't know, it's meant to make cobalt in the end. And uranite. Okay, uranite. Yeah, that makes uranium, right? And then sphalerite makes zinc? What the? Okay, fine. Let's just go ahead and say that this refinery was meant to separate all kinds of metals from whatever medium they existed in, because wow, that's a lot of stuff. And I'm pretty sure that most of the metals are separated differently from all the rest of the metals. And this entire absolute barge that the Nostromo is supposed to be towing is supposed to be taking care of this en route during her, I believe it was about an 8-month transit back to Earth. Anywho, I'm getting off track, even though that's obviously not something that ever happens here. Where I was trying to go with this is, yes, you can imagine that the refinery aspect of this is quite large. I mean, it's carrying a lot of raw materials as well, otherwise it wouldn't be worth the trip, but all the equipment necessary to do all of the mineral separations takes up a lot of volume and adds a lot of mass. Also a lot of complication. Which is why, after all, even though Humies apparently cannot transit between the tugs and the interstellar refineries, they do actually have Seegson model synthetics on board. And for those of you all not familiar with the alien universe, synthetics are otherwise known as androids, robots, humanoid-ish robots, although the Seegson models range from barely passable to close enough. Also, as I mentioned, this thing is quite large. It is 6,322 feet long, and masses in somewhere at, it's hard to say. It can carry 20 million tons of mineral ore, though. So just imagine how big and heavy the rest of the equipment would have to be to accommodate that. Which brings us back to the Nostromo, after all, because she only masses in total at 63,000 tons. And she's only about 1,095 feet long, so about a sixth the length of the actual barge she's towing, about 705 feet wide and about 320 feet tall. So she is quite a large vehicle, and you kind of have to ask yourself why, in fact, she is so large. I mean, on average, tugboats on your planet are much smaller than just 1/6 the length of the cargo they're towing. So why is this one so particularly large? I mean, granted, the cargo she is towing is quite massive in both the volumetric sense and the mass sense, but more interestingly, the Nostromo did not start her career, as a tugboat. While the Alien movie takes place in 2122, the ship was built in 2101 as an interstellar cruiser. Now, it's not abundantly clear what the term interstellar cruiser means. I can tell you that she is in fact a Lockmart Charlie Mike TAC 88 Bravo Bison, but that still doesn't really explain what a interstellar cruiser is. Oh, and by the way, Lockmart is what Lockheed Martin Corporation eventually turned into, for whatever that's worth. Anyways, in 2116, she went through a full-on refit and became a tugboat. And when I say a full-on refit, I'm not joking here. Those port and starboard pylons that are so notable on the Nostromo ship's design, yeah, they originally housed one each Saturn J TAC 3000 engines. It's unclear what the specifics are on those, but they were in fact replaced, both of them were replaced, with Rolls-Royce November 66 Cyclone thrust engines. And this apparently gave the Nostromo the vectored thrust capability that you can see on the bow and stern of those pylons, about how there are some vents that are pointed down. Well, those basically apparently gave the Nostromo the capacity to land on a planet successfully. And understand that in the alien verse, the Humies are still using reaction thrust drives. So basically, they are taking the thrust that would otherwise go out of the massive thrust bell at the stern of those pylons and instead directing it downward-ish to help the vehicle land on planetary surfaces. Again, it's relatively unclear whether the interstellar cruiser mode of the Bison could accomplish landings on planets. She does have landing gear, the Nostromo does now, 3 separate gear units, but it's also unclear whether those were part of the refit. Now, what's interesting is those are hardly the only engines on board the Nostromo. In fact, at the very middle of her main body, there is a single Yutani J38 thruster group. Not really clear what it does there, but it's there. And on top of the body, just underneath the docking arm clamp connector, that weird bulge that's on top of the Nostromo, you have 2 Lockmart Tango Lima TAC 30 thruster groups, again with the thruster groups. I am assuming that the engines are engines and the thrusters are thrusters, but they're all pointing in the same direction, so they're all still generating thrust in a forward direction. But wait, there's more! Underneath the, well, let's call it the head of the Nostromo, but forward of the C-deck observation blister, which is probably why it's retractable, are in fact 3 separate, what were they? Wayland Lima 46 chemical and maneuvering engines. I don't know why those are there. I imagine they help with takeoff or something, perhaps, because they're on a particularly odd vector. And again, since they're using reaction drive engines, the engines push the opposite direction they're pointed. So, yeah, maybe they just needed additional engines for takeoff or something, or for undocking. I don't know. It's unclear. You'll keep hearing me say it's unclear, even though there are actually blueprints of this entire boat, which is fascinating because there are so many little details that they added in, but they didn't really explain a lot of them. And the problem is, where they did try to explain the details, they maybe lost track of conversions or something. I don't know. At one part of one of the pages of the blueprints for the Nostromo, it specifies that each one of the Rolls-Royce main engines on board the Nostromo, the ones in the pylons, can generate 64.9 giganewtons of thrust. That's a lot of thrust, yo. But just on the other side of the same page of the blueprints, it does specify that if you leave both engines wide open, throttle wide open, you get 131,660 kilonewtons of force. Now, I'm not too up on your particular ways of keeping track of your various forces and vectors and weights and masses and all that rest of that nonsense, but I'm fairly certain, not terribly, that there should be a mega in between kilo and giga, right? So if you go from 131,000 kilonewtons, you'd get to like 0.1 giganewtons. Pretty sure. Because that'd be like 131 meganewtons. Probably. I don't know. This is always the problem with non-engineers coming up with answers to problems that artists came up with. Details. Now, the fun detail is that if you use the lower number, 131.6 meganewtons of force, combined force between the two engines at wide open throttle, you're about at twice the maximum power output of, a SpaceX Super Heavy, which weighs in at, what were the numbers again? Goodness gracious. 74,400 kilonewtons, so 74.4 meganewtons. I only point this out specifically because back in, when was Alien made again? 1979, I believe it was, sometime in that period. That was considered to be an absurd amount of thrust. I mean, she's towing 20 million tons of material, not just, the barge weighs probably twice that by itself. So let's just go ahead and call it an even 40,000 tons of material. Now, she's towing it through the vacuum of space and not having to argue with launching off the ground in a gravity well and this, that, and the other. But really, those numbers were meant to be like off the charts, absurd nuts. And here you humans are, cranking out almost half that much power right now, today. Ain't that awesome? Now, it's worth noting, while we're talking about engines, that the Nostromo does have something that the Super Heavy does not, and that is, in fact, a Yutani Tango 7 Alpha November Lima Sierra Tachyon Shunt Super Light Drive. And basically what this little honker does is lets the Nostromo go approximately 153 C, that is to say 153 times the speed of light, while unladen. When she's towing around that massive refinery behind her, she can only pull about 40 C, which is still pretty decent if you ask me. If we want to use Star Trek terms, apparently warp factor 3 is approximately 39 times the speed of light. So, warp factor 3 for a tug towing a massive refinery behind her is pretty solid. And I will acknowledge that the warp factor to speed of light conversion ratio very much depends on who you talk to and who wrote the story and this, that, and the other. So, you know what? The comparison is probably moot. Anyways, moving on. One interesting thing about the blueprints that are once again contained in this awesome book, Alien the Blueprints by Graham J. Langridge, is that they note that the blueprints for the Nostromo are basically complete for the human habitable sections of the ship. And they specifically note that anything that is you see as like empty space on the ship, a void, something that doesn't have something else inside of it, well, it's either fusion reactor fuel or it's reaction mass, because again, they're using reaction engines. And specifically, the reaction mass that they're using is water, which brings me back to the refinery and wondering if that connection between the tug and the refinery might allow some transfer of water from one to the other just to refuel it along the way. Because unfortunately, while water is a pretty decent reaction mass for a fusion drive, there's one small detail. It does not compress very well, technically almost not at all. So you're going to go through it quick. But this leads me to my one possibly only-ish, let's not call it only because we'll get there at some point, complaint about the Nostromo. is that she tows her refinery behind her with reaction drives that are obstructed by the refinery behind her. Are you seeing the problem? This is kind of like the stupid idea that some of you humies have of using a fan on a sailboat to push the sail on the sailboat. That doesn't work. Only in this case, this fan is generating 131 meganewtons of force and totally just like ablating the hell out of the thing behind it. Or, well, it might not be. So I found this image on the intertubes from a comic related to the alien universe. And this is the only representation I have been able to find that did show a clear and distinct exhaust port system for the Nostromo's engines through the refinery. So you mean to tell me that they hooked up this tugboat to a refinery that literally has 3 massive channels running the entire length of the refinery just so the tug can pull the refinery? What? I mean, let's not even get into how you couldn't collimate the exhaust perfectly enough that it wouldn't just abrade the entire inside of those channels massively. But why not just not obstruct the engines? I mean, it's clear that the mass, center of gravity, center of mass, center of not buoyancy, because we're in space, on this thing is totally fornicated. Why are we... I mean, come on. I especially love how the channels are like right above the water blisters and they don't seem to care at all. And it's just making it up as it goes, isn't it? But again, as we mentioned previously, this is what happens when artistes make their masterpieces and then someone tries to come along behind them and explain it all. Well, then assholes like me come along behind them and pick at it. Which, after all, is what this channel's all about. But anyways, I made a reference to the interior structure of the Nostromo, so I guess we might as well start discussing the interior structure of the Nostromo. Because, well, why not? Anyways, she is divided between 3 separate decks, the Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie decks, although the Alpha deck actually has an upper level, which I don't think you ever actually see in the movie, but it's some weird thing on top of the actual bridge area. I don't know how that got added in. Also, interesting note about the bridge itself. It used to be 4 feet taller, or rather the ceiling used to be 4 feet higher when they almost started filming. And then Ridley Scott did, again, what Ridley Scott do, and came in and told the prop designers to cut off 4 feet from the walls, basically, because he wanted a cramped, confined space. In fact, the entire movie was deliberately designed to evoke a claustrophobic feeling, even if you're not actually claustrophobic. One fascinating detail about the production of the movie is that the sets were almost entirely enclosed. And I don't mean that they were closed sets and that they wouldn't let randos go wandering through the set, because of course they wouldn't let randos go wandering through the set. But they actually built the corridors for the Nostromo and didn't build them to have like takeaway walls to make filming easier. Because most of indoor shots for most of Hollywood these days are missing at least one and possibly more walls and ceilings and this, that, and the other, just because that makes lighting and sound and filming so much easier. But no, Ridley Scott being Ridley Scott, again, he built fully enclosed sets. So the cameramen were in the sets with the actors while they were trying to do their things. And if you watch the movie and you pay attention, a lot of the shots are actually from handheld cameras. You can see it kind of wobble and bobble around, and that's not a complaint. It's actually a stylistic feature, a detail that the director is deliberately choosing because it makes you feel part of the crew. You're there with them, experiencing the entire situation while they're experiencing it themselves, which again is a deliberate stylistic choice and one that I think worked out pretty well. I mean, filming on this set was so complicated that actors and actresses were having to hold flamethrowers close to their face simply because that was the only way there was enough lighting on their faces for the cameras to get a good shot of them. Yes, that is Ridley Scott for you, ladies and gentle people. He was asking actors to nearly singe their faces simply to ensure that the space was appropriately claustrophobic for the viewer because he didn't want to put more lights in. Fascinating director. Also fascinating set, honestly. Anywho, where was I? Right, the Alpha Deck. The Alpha Deck is basically where not all the movie takes place, but a significant chunk of the movie. It contains 4, 5-ish of the significant spaces that significant events take place in this significant movie, blah, blah, blah. First off, you've, of course, as I mentioned previously, got the bridge, where everyone is present and doing their jobs while the ship is landing and almost crashing, and then taking off and doing other things and this, that, and the other. The bridge that is now 4 feet shorter and much more complicated to film in than the initial prop builders had planned on having it be. Regardless, immediately off the bridge to the starboard stern is the mother interface chamber. Now, mother's an interesting thing. Mother is actually how you would pronounce, you Humies would pronounce, Mike Uniform / Tango Hotel / Uniform Romeo. Now, that's an acronym, obviously. It's never explained what the acronym actually stands for. But regardless, the Nostromo has a Mother 6000 with, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 terabytes of memory on board as her artificial intelligence main operating system for the entire ship. Now, it's unclear whether the 2 terabytes of memory is static memory or random access memory. It's kind of immaterial. Again, much like the engine thrust outputs that we quoted earlier, 2 terabytes in 1979 is just incomprehensible. But 2 terabytes, when this video comes out on your planet, is like you have those on your desktops. Hell, for some of you Humies, you have those on your laptops, but that's besides the point. In any case, the primary access point for the Mother AI mainframe computer that controls the entire Nostromo is just stern and on starboard side of the bridge. Now, what's interesting is actually the Mother mainframe itself, herself, however you want to phrase it, is actually down on the beta deck and way far separate from the access point that's just off the bridge. I'm not sure why they designed it this way, because you have to run all these conduits, all this distance to connect the interface, let's call it a niche, to the actual mainframe itself. Why not just put the mainframe directly underneath the interface niche? I don't know. I wasn't there. I didn't design it. Regardless, directly astern of the bridge, you get into the galley. Well, the rec space. Well, just kind of the open space that the crew has to use. And this is where a lot of the movie actually transpires. This is the big table that the crew are sitting around when they're talking to each other when they get out of hypersleep. This is the big table that they're all sitting around talking to each other when, well, things start to go horribly, horribly wrong. And this is where the aesthetics of the movie really start to show themselves. Because you see, in this particular space specifically, it's fairly well lit, which allows you to see almost everything going on, which, when things start to go wrong, allows you to see everything that's going wrong. But more specifically, the space has lots and lots of details. If you remember when someone is trying to choke someone else out, there's all kinds of photos on walls pinned up and this, that, and the other. And there's all kinds of wear and tear on the walls and the floor and the ceiling even, and everything else in between. This is clearly a working ship that is meant to emulate the tractor-trailer, semi-tractor rigs that are on your planet that tow things from point A to point B. Because, all of those trucks, those tractor-trailers or whatever they're called, are lived in, and they're homes for so many people for so long, so that they begin to wear and tear and have things stuck up on them, and they just become kind of a home for these people. And in this case, the Nostromo did in fact become a home for the crew. But somehow, actually, the aesthetic is deeper than that. You see, in the crew part of the Nostromo, the walls, the bulkheads, whatever you want to call them, and the ceilings, and not really the floors, I guess, but mostly the walls were covered in what is called tufted or button-tufted upholstery. That's that squishy-looking, overinflated, kind of cushy-looking upholstery that they built into the walls. They did this for a reason. See, that padded, quilted appearance makes you kind of feel at home, right? It kind of feels soft and comfortable and squishy and all that other nonsense that you humies seem to appreciate for your living spaces. But it also makes it more claustrophobic, right? Because you have to know that the wall is actually behind the squishy parts. The squishy parts are actually coming off the wall, and they're starting to bite into the space that you have. That, I mean, honestly, is there a reason for those squishy parts to be there? I don't think there is. That padding is just there to be padding. Why is it biting into the living space you have? Why is it biting into the small amount of space you have on this ship? Why is it cutting into what little volume you have that is your own? And that's part of the marvelous monstrosity that is the Nostromo. Because you see, the Nostromo is actually split up between two separate areas. There is, in fact, the crew quarters, and then there are the engineering sections. And as we mentioned, the crew quarters are lived in. They have little personal details all over the place. Photos, pictures, even if they're simply just porn. That means someone was there and someone wanted to look at that for however long they were there. It's an indication that someone was staying there, that a Humie was spending time in that space. Well, probably a male Humie, but possibly a female Humie too. I mean, I'm not going to be the one to judge either direction. It doesn't matter to me personally. But it was also fairly well lit. And again, it was padded. It was squishy, but confining. And finally, it had all the funny little bells and whistles that you would expect for a space that people live and work in on a daily basis. In fact, a lot of the buttons on the Nostromo set actually did exactly what they did in the movie. When you pushed a button to open or close a hatch, that is in fact what happened on the set. They wired them up that precisely. In fact, all of the displays on the bridge showed exactly what they showed in the movie. They filmed the displays live. They made whatever was being on those displays and displayed it on the displays. I feel like I've said displayed enough. And all of this is in stark contrast to the engineering spaces, because these are utilitarian. These are dark. These are dim. These are full of sharp edges and exposed wiring and conduits and control systems and this, that, and the fornicatingly other. There is no porn stuck up on walls down here. There's just, well, dripping water, which is, I mean, honestly, in context, it makes sense, because again, the Nostromo used water for a reaction mass. And if you assume that everything other than where the Humies have access to is just full of water, well, water always wins, so it's always going to leak. But anyways, once again, I got hung up on something. The crew galley of the Nostromo, that's right. Because once you go directly stern from the crew galley of the Nostromo, you hit one of the major junction points of the ship. You can go up, down, forward, port, or starboard. And if you go starboard, well, you get to basically the, what's it called? The hypersleep compartment. Now, this is where the Humies are, frankly, stored while the ship is plowing its way across many, many light years of space, but not quite fast enough that the Humies can actually tolerate. Like I said, it was going to take somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 months for the ship to get from wherever the hell it was to Earth, carrying its cargo of hopefully refined material by the time they get to Earth. Well, ain't no Humie wants to spend 10 months on this blessed tub doing absolutely nothing, so they colloquially freeze them. They're not technically frozen, but they are in a very suspended state of animation. Their life signs are basically at nil. They are not aging. They are not doing anything. which is probably better for them because then we could get into sidereal physics, and I don't think this particular episode is ready for that yet. Anyways, this is the kind of the opening scene of the Alien movie when everyone wakes up out of their little tubes and rubs themselves off and toddles off in their underwear to, well, the space kind of halfway between that junction room that I mentioned previously and the hypersleep chamber. Halfway between the two, there is kind of like a locker room where all the Humies kept their clothes and their gear and everything else they wanted to keep along with them while they were in hypersleep, or while they were on the ship, I guess. I mean, they do have a bunk room somewhere. I'd have to find it on the map again. But regardless, the locker room does serve as kind of like all right, I'm stumbling and bumbling out of hypersleep, trying to find my clothes. Oh, look, this thing has my name on it. Let's put whatever is inside of it on my body. Because you Humies do have this weird hang-up about bare skin and all that nonsense. Regardless, if you go back to that junction room yet again and go to the port side of the Nostromo, you will discover the med bay. Now, the med bay is fascinating. It's only designed for one sick or damaged Humie. Now, on a crew of 7, ideally, you have no sick or damaged Humies. So I guess technically just having one would be a problem alone by itself, and having 2 would be even worse. So just having one is a big enough problem. Let's go ahead and get them fixed. And the med bay is simply designed to fix and solve one Humie's problem. The med bay is, after all, where the, let's go with infected Humie ended up and was examined, and the other crew members, not all necessarily Humies, tried to remove the, face hugger from his face. And, well, that didn't go too great. That's when they discovered that, the xenomorph species and all forms of its life have acid for blood. Not just acid, but like concentrated, dangerous acid. But that's not what we're here to talk about. What we're here to talk about is a fascinating design of the med bay. The meta-fascinating design of the med bay is that a lot of the props and details and accessories that you can find in the med bay are actual medical equipment that could be found on your planet when the movie was developed. But that's not actually what we're here to talk about. Instead, the med bay is kind of designed as a little more than like a half circle. I guess it's like 3/4 of a circle. And it's all fixated around the hinge point for the single bed in the med bay. And the bed can be kind of in the middle of the room if you're treating the Humie directly, or the bed can simply rotate on its central axis, again at the middle point of the circle of the room, to allow the bed to kind of slide into the autodock so that the Humie in question can be scanned and examined. And if the ship were actually built out properly and properly equipped, which the Nostromo wasn't, if the medbay found something that was problematic, it could rotate the other direction, let's go with leftwise, until the Humie on the bed was in a elevator that would lower them to the lower deck, the Bravo deck, intensive care ward, which was, well, frankly, one of the sacrificial anodes of the update that the Bison went through before she became a Tug. She doesn't actually have a comprehensive intensive care suite anymore. She simply just has the medbay. Good luck. But anyways, I do believe that rounds out all the interesting spaces on the Alpha deck. We should move on to the Bravo deck, even though we've kind of already made an oblique reference to it. The Bravo deck, or perhaps Beta deck, has such interesting things as the docking tube crew and personnel egress. That big ol' stalk coming off the front of the Nostromo, yeah, that's her docking port. It's not a refueling port. She's actually meant to dock, I guess, with stations by way of that massive tube thing coming off her front on the starboard side, technically. On the port side, you have the communications array and radar dish manual station. I'm not sure why they actually mixed the radar station and the communication station, because those are going to be a problematic feature to have together, but 1970 science fiction. They weren't paying attention to such things as, physics. After that, and I do mean after in both meanings of the word, you've got the entire fornicating decontamination suite that the, 3 or 4 humies who went out to go explore the engineer's ship should have been shoved into on their way back if, a certain, undercover android hadn't, unfortunately obeyed his base programming and done something he wasn't supposed to do. Because yes, actually, the Nostromo does in fact have a complete decontamination suite. You can stay in there for days, weeks, perhaps even months, and you've got enough space to do whatever you need to do in those times. But no, androids, yo. And after that, and by way of clarification, I do mean behind that, you have the forward landing gear, in front of the forward landing gear, you have a couple workspaces, and then the landing gear, and then one of the garages on the ship, and then finally the actual mother core. The mother core, like I mentioned previously, is on the beta deck, Bravo deck, however you want to call it, not directly beneath the actual mother alcove. Again, I don't know why they did this, but choices were made, and these are the choices they made. You never actually see the mother core in the movie. You don't actually see the decontamination rooms either, or the workspaces, or most of Bravo deck, honestly. But this is where things start to get a little strange. Because technically, below Bravo deck would naturally be the Charlie deck. Obviously, sure, fine, makes perfect sense. We did A, B, C in opposite order, I suppose. We did descending order, yes, literally. Except that Charlie deck has an upper deck, just like Alpha deck had an upper deck. And Charlie's upper deck apparently is at the same level as the Bravo deck. Now, why is it not Bravo deck? I don't know. The technical answer is that because Bravo deck does not connect directly to Charlie upper. It has to go through Charlie lower. But the funny thing is that looking at the diagrams of Bravo and Charlie lower and then Charlie upper, I can't honestly see how you get between Bravo and, I can see how you get between Bravo and Charlie lower, but I can't see how you get between Charlie lower and Charlie upper. And Charlie upper is quantifiably not connected to any form of alpha. So how do the humies, specifically the 2 engineers that the Nostromo had on board, get from the quote-unquote living spaces to the quote-unquote engineering spaces? Maybe they have to crawl through the air ducts just like the alien does? I don't know. Once again, this is the ongoing problem with artistes making it up as they go, and illustrators filling in for engineers, trying to fill in the blanks for the artistes. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the end, does it? Oh, and I totally forgot that Charlie deck actually has a lower deck. All right. Anyways, we're going to talk about the lower deck. The lower deck is basically where Ash was keeping in contact with the away team while they went to go visit the engineer ship. That's that weird kind of cubby alcove kind of thing with the big window and the slidey chair that he was trying to communicate with the away team while they were off doing, getting themselves infected by a fornicating facehugger. Fine. So we've got Alpha deck and Upper Alpha deck. And Bravo deck, which apparently is just plain Bravo deck, and Charlie deck, Upper Charlie deck, and then Lower Charlie deck. Do you humies understand why these decks are lettered? Because you don't have to think about which deck you're on. Is it Upper Charlie or is it Bravo? Because apparently they're at the same level inside of the Nostromo. Why do you name them differently? I get that they're non-contiguous, but they are at the same level in the ship. Which, yes, is my second big complaint with the Nostromo. I mean, the whole, exhaust ducting nonsense is absolute bullshit, and there's no way around it. But the way they categorize the decks is just redonkulous. And technically, neither of these particular details came up in the movie, aside from the obvious fact that the Nostromo did dock in a way that her stern exhaust ports were obstructed by the refinery that she was towing, which raised a lot of questions. And, I mean, if they wanted to go down the whole, reactionless drive path, it might not have mattered. But no, they didn't. They went the other direction. And, I mean, if these diagrams were just a touch different, I could possibly believe the whole Alpha Bravo Charlie nonsense. But when there's no discernible way to get from the rest of the ship to Upper Charlie, which requires going through Lower Charlie, or perhaps Middle Charlie, because I guess Lower Charlie is that observation blister. But regardless, to get to the Narcissus escape craft that was bolted on to the Nostromo, the little tiny kind of pumpkin seed-shaped pod that Ripley and apparently a facehugger takes for a ride after the Nostromo goes pop. Well, you have to go through the Upper Charlie deck. And it's not really clear how you get there aside from Lower Charlie deck, or again, Middle Charlie deck. And again, I don't know how you get to Middle Charlie deck from the rest of the ship. So, yeah. See, again, well, actually, this is not a case of artists messing everything up. The thing is, the artists for the movie did an outstanding job. They built living spaces that looked lived in. They built living spaces that looked safe and comforting, but somehow also claustrophobic at the time. They were well lit in the most horrifying ways, while the engineering spaces were full of edges and corners and meaningless displays and this, that, and the fornicating other. No pads, there was lots of claustrophobia, but no soft way of going about it. It was all just sharp and mean and angry, and grated floors and water moisture dripping from everywhere, even before the alien got loose. But this is yet again one of those perfect examples of show, don't explain. The engineering spaces on the Nostromo were obviously the engineering spaces. They were dark, they were dim, they were cramped, they were wet. The living spaces in the Nostromo were basically the opposite. They were brightly lit, padded, not wet, plastered with personal products, including photos of, half to fully naked females and possibly even males. I don't know. I didn't pay that much close attention. But the distinction of the visual representation made it very clear where you were on the ship at any given moment. The bridge, being kind of a natural exception, was cramped, but covered in displays and switches and seats and emergency helmets and all these kind of things you'd expect on a spacefaring ship bridge. It all fit visually. And then, of course, someone had to come behind them and try to explain it all. And honestly, like I've said, the book is pretty awesome. I've got no real complaints about the book. The detail, the artistry, the specifics, well, okay, the specifics are a problem, but just the level of attention that was provided to the artistry is worth credit alone. But maybe actually, talk to an engineer before setting pen to paper and conflicting yourself on literally the same page. Is that too much to ask for? I honestly don't know. Regardless, it has been 38 years since the last Alien Universe movie, and I'm sure all of the fans are very happy to go back to that particular universe, and I sincerely hope that Alien Romulus lives up to the standards of the other two movies in the verse. Let's hope that was actually the case. Oh, and someone make a note to remind me to do an episode on the semiotic standard iconography found all over the Alien movies and an entire franchise, because after all, it deserves an episode of its own. And that's all from Sacred Cow Shipyards. Please be advised that any ship left on the docks for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Have a nice day.